For 10 long years, Daniel Wade believed he had built the perfect life, a quiet home in Cedar Falls, a loyal wife named Monica, and 2 children who adored him enough to race toward the door each time he came home from his job as a correctional officer. Yet beneath that calm surface lived a slow-growing rot that Daniel never suspected until one winter night when a voicemail meant for another man landed on his phone by mistake. A voice he recognized far too well, whispering intimate words clearly meant for someone else. Words that cracked his world with a silent violence that felt worse than any bullet he had ever seen during prison duty. And as Daniel replayed the message again and again, he began connecting dots from the last decade, the unusual late-night calls, Monica's sudden interest in privacy, her growing distance masked as exhaustion, her weekend trips to her sister's house, and the more he thought, the more he realized that everything he believed about his life had been constructed on deceit. And what made it unbearable was that he had sacrificed his own dreams for her, taken double shifts, missed holidays, and forced himself to believe her excuses because he loved her deeply, the kind of love that blinded him even when the truth stood in front of him, waving red flags. And as he sat alone in the living room with the voicemail echoing in the silence, Daniel felt the ground beneath him shifting, his breathing turning shallow, and the familiar world around him suddenly feeling foreign, as if he had woken up in someone else's life. And yet he said nothing to Monica when she came home, choosing instead to observe her carefully, to study her actions with the heightened awareness of a man who suddenly realized his reality had been a lie. He noticed the way she smiled at her phone, the way she tucked it under her pillow at night, the way she dodged simple questions with overly sweet explanations. And as days passed, Daniel's quiet anger grew into something heavier, something he never imagined he'd feel. Not because of betrayal alone, but because he knew the man in the voicemail, Evan Brooks, an old friend and longtime visitor to their home. Someone Daniel had trusted enough to invite to someone who had shared beers with him while laughing about work, someone who had been near his children, someone who had shaken his hand without guilt in his eyes. And the realization that the affair had lasted a decade made Daniel feel as though he had been robbed, not just of love, but of time, dignity, and the identity he had built around being a husband and father. And on that night, Daniel sat in the dark, thinking about what a man becomes when the truth shatters everything he thought he was. In the week that followed his discovery, Daniel became a silent investigator in his own home, a man who smiled at breakfast while his mind replayed every moment of his marriage with unsettling clarity, noticing small details that once seemed insignificant but now felt like pieces of a puzzle he had ignored for too long, such as Monica's sudden interest in improving her wardrobe a few years earlier, her insistence on girls' trips that never included pictures, and her distant expressions during family moments that should have filled her with joy. Yet Daniel had dismissed all of it because he believed every marriage went through phases that ebbed and flowed. But now, standing in the same kitchen where they once danced to old music long after the kids fell asleep, he felt like he was living with a stranger who had spent an entire decade constructing a second life behind his back. And what made the betrayal sharper was the way Monica acted unaffected, going about her day with the easy confidence of someone who had practiced deception for years. and Daniel wondered how she managed to lie so effortlessly. How she looked into his eyes every morning while hiding a world of secrets behind her soft smiles. And though Daniel wanted to confront her, he feared that doing so would break something permanently. Not the marriage, because he felt that was already broken, but the fragile control he still had over himself. For inside him was a storm rising quickly, a mixture of grief, humiliation, and fury that he didn't trust to contain in a conversation. So he chose to gather more evidence, hoping that understanding the full scope of the betrayal might help him decide what came next. He followed her car one afternoon after she claimed she was meeting her sister, only to watch her pull into a quiet cafe 15 miles from home, where Evan arrived moments later, the two sharing a table with the easy familiarity of people who had repeated the same lies for years. Their laughter light, their shoulders brushing casually, and Daniel felt a painful tightness in his chest. Not because of jealousy, but because he saw the truth laid bare for the first time. His marriage was not only over, but had been over for years, without his awareness, and his role had been reduced to a caretaker who paid bills, provided stability, and unknowingly offered his trust as cover for their affair. Yet even in that moment, Daniel did nothing except watch from his truck, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, his breathing slow and shaky as he struggled to absorb the reality unfolding just a few yards away. He realized then that betrayal wasn't just the act of being lied to, but the realization that the life you valued most held no value to the people you valued most. And though he drove home without confronting Monica, he carried with him a heaviness that settled inside him like a shadow he couldn't shake, a shadow that whispered that he was no longer the man he used to be, and that something inside him had shifted in a way he didn't fully understand yet. Daniel woke the next morning feeling drained, as though the betrayal had begun reshaping him from the inside, hollowing out pieces of himself. He had always relied on patience, self-control, and faith in others, and as Monica prepared breakfast with her usual cheerful tone, he watched her carefully, studying the slight tremble in her hands as she poured coffee and the thin smile she forced when she noticed him observing her. And he realized that perhaps she sensed his coldness, even though he hadn't said a word. She seemed distant, guarded, as if she feared something had changed. And Daniel wondered whether guilt had finally begun pressing on her after years of secrecy. Yet her composure remained mostly intact, enough to irritate him, because her calmness made him feel as though his pain was invisible, insignificant, and unworthy of acknowledgement. And as the day progressed, Daniel's mind replayed old memories that once gave him comfort. Monica laughing after he proposed, the birth of their children, the nights they planned their future. Yet each memory felt tainted now, twisted into reminders of promises broken long before he knew they were broken. And the more he thought, the more he sensed an internal shift, as if the betrayal had pushed him past a threshold he never imagined crossing. He felt a quiet rage growing in him, not explosive, but cold and steady, the kind that sits beneath the surface, waiting for a moment to rise. And he found himself walking through the house, observing every photograph, every object, every shared memory with new eyes, noticing how many sacrifices he had made while Monica built a second life behind closed doors. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. studying the lines on his face, the tiredness in his eyes. And the reflection startled him because he no longer recognized the man staring back. A man who looked older, harder, and filled with a silent resolve that came not from courage, but from loss. And at that moment, Daniel realized that he had reached a breaking point, a moment where silence was no longer possible, where pretending was no longer sustainable, and where the truth demanded to be addressed no matter the consequence. He walked into the living room where Monica sat texting, and though he didn't speak, she looked up suddenly, as if sensing a shift in the air, her expression flickering with unease for the first time in years. And Daniel felt something cold settle inside him as he realized that the life they built was about to shatter in ways neither of them could control. That night, when the house settled into silence and the children slept in their rooms, unaware of the tension brewing beneath their roof, Daniel approached Monica with the calmness of someone who had rehearsed every word in his head, yet still didn't know how to begin. And when she looked up from the couch, her face stiffened slightly, as if bracing for something she couldn't name, and Daniel sat across from her, staring at her for a long moment before finally telling her, followed her to the cafe, and knew everything. And in that instant, Monica's entire posture changed as the mask she had worn for years crumbled, her face draining of color while her lips parted with a soft breath of panic. And instead of offering a confession or apology, she began explaining herself in quiet, trembling tones, weaving excuses about loneliness, emotional distance, and mistakes that had spiraled out of her control. But Daniel couldn't process her words because every sentence felt like a delayed knife, each explanation revealing just how deliberate the betrayal had been, as she admitted the affair had lasted nearly the entire decade. And when he asked why she stayed married if she loved someone else, Monica's answer that she needed stability and didn't want to break the family hit Daniel harder than anything he expected, because it implied he had been useful but not loved, needed but not valued. And that realization sank deep into his chest like a heavy weight he couldn't lift. The conversation stretched into an hour of half-truths, accusations, and quiet desperation, but nothing felt resolved. And Daniel watched Monica as she cried softly, not from remorse, but from fear of losing the comfortable life she had maintained. And as he listened, Daniel felt a detached stillness inside him, as though the emotional chaos had burned itself out, leaving only a cold emptiness that frightened him more than the betrayal itself. When the conversation ended, Monica retreated to the bedroom while Daniel remained in the living room, staring at the darkened hallway and feeling the weight of the moment pressing on him. And he knew that nothing about this night would fade quickly, that something irreversible had formed between them, a fracture too deep to repair. And as he sat alone in the dim glow of the lamp, Daniel sensed an ominous shift in himself, a realization that he was standing at the edge of a dangerous emotional precipice, and whatever came next would define the rest of his life. The following morning brought no relief, only a tense quietness that filled the house like fog, and Monica moved through the rooms, avoiding Daniel's eyes, while he remained withdrawn, observing her with a cold detachment that made her visibly nervous. And though he didn't raise his voice or express anger, his silence felt heavier than any outburst could have, creating an atmosphere thick with unspoken fears. And as Monica tried to act normal, offering him coffee, asking about his plans, and pretending everything was manageable, Daniel noticed how her hands shook and how her voice wavered, as if she sensed that something inside him had shifted beyond her control. And though he had no intention of harming her or anyone else, he recognized that the storm inside him made his presence feel unpredictable to her, which only intensified her anxiety. Throughout the day, Daniel found himself drifting mentally, replaying memories, not to understand Monica's betrayal, but to understand himself, wondering how he had become a man who overlooked obvious signs, how he had allowed loyalty to blind him, and how he had failed to protect his own emotional well-being. And while he knew people reacted differently to heartbreak, he felt a creeping unease at the depth of numbness that had settled inside him, a numbness that made him feel hollow, almost mechanical, going through motions without emotion. And this detachment frightened him because it wasn't natural, and he feared what that kind of emptiness could lead to if it deepened. Meanwhile, Monica spent the day in a quiet panic, texting rapidly, making hushed phone calls, and even stepping outside several times, as if trying to coordinate something behind his back. And though Daniel didn't follow her, he observed her behavior with the focus of a man who understood that his marriage was falling apart publicly for the first time, and the realization made him feel physically ill. Later that evening, when Monica finally gathered the courage to tell him she needed space and planned to stay at her sister's house for a few days, Daniel simply nodded, not because he agreed, but because he didn't have the energy to object. And as she packed her things nervously, Daniel felt a growing dread that something significant was unfolding, something that extended beyond the betrayal itself. And though he couldn't name it, he sensed the shape of conflict forming in the distance like a storm cloud, slowly drifting closer. By the time Monica left, the house felt painfully quiet, and Daniel wandered through each room feeling as though he was walking through the remnants of a life that had ended without warning. And for the first time since discovering the affair, he realized that the true threat wasn't Monica's betrayal or Evan's presence. It was the darkness forming inside him, the kind of emotional void that had the potential to turn a wounded man into someone unrecognizable, even to himself. After Monica left, the silence inside the house felt suffocating, and Daniel found himself pacing aimlessly until he finally stepped outside for air, driving without purpose until he reached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, where his childhood home once stood, a place he hadn't visited in years because it held memories of a father who taught him strength through silence and a mother who believed that men should endure pain without complaint. And as he parked near the empty lot where the old house had been demolished years ago, Daniel felt the weight of his upbringing settle on him like a heavy coat, reminding him how deeply his life had been shaped by lessons he never questioned. Lessons about loyalty, responsibility, and sacrifice that had guided everything he built as an adult. Standing there, he reflected on how he had carried those values into his marriage, how he had given Monica the stability she claimed to need, how he had worked long hours believing it made him a good provider, and how he had never once thought she could take advantage of his commitment. But now those same values felt like chains binding him to a past version of himself that was no longer useful. Aversion to trusting, to forgiving, and too willing to ignore his own needs. And as he walked across the empty lot, Daniel realized that the betrayal hadn't merely damaged his marriage. It had stripped away the identity he had built for a lifetime. He sat on a fallen log and let his mind drift through memories of adolescence, remembering the arguments between his parents, the nights his mother cried quietly, and the way his father dismissed her feelings in the name of strength. And Daniel wondered whether he had repeated those same patterns without realizing it, by sacrificing his emotional well-being while focusing only on being a provider. And this moment of reflection unsettled him because it forced him to confront not just Monica's actions, but his own flaws, acknowledging that marriages rarely fall apart because of one mistake, but because of years of unresolved wounds, unspoken needs, and emotional drift. Sitting there as the wind moved lazily through the dried grass, Daniel felt the first small shift inside him, a faint sense of clarity that told him he needed to reclaim his life, not through anger, but through understanding. Not through revenge, but through stepping away from the role he had forced himself into for years. He stayed at the site until dusk, watching the sunlight fade over the field. And by the time he returned to his truck, he had made a quiet decision. He would confront Evan, not in violence, but in the pursuit of answers, closure, and truth, because only then could he decide who he would become after this chapter of his life finally ended. The next morning, Daniel drove to Evan Brooks's workplace, a modest auto shop on the edge of town. And as he pulled into the gravel parking lot, he felt a controlled uneasiness. Not anger, but a cold curiosity about the man who had been part of his life for years, while secretly dismantling it. And Daniel watched Evan through the shop's open bay door as he tightened bolts on a truck engine, laughing with another mechanic as though he carried no secrets, no guilt, and no awareness of the emotional wreckage he had caused. After a moment, Daniel stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel, and Evan turned with a surprised smile that vanished instantly when he saw the look on Daniel's face. A look that held no aggression, but carried a depth of exhaustion that made Evan straighten nervously. Daniel spoke calmly, telling him he knew everything, and Evan's expression shifted from shock to discomfort as he wiped his hands on a rag and led Daniel behind the shop where they could talk privately. And though Daniel expected an apology or explanation, he found Evan offering only fragmented reasons: attraction, familiarity, none of which gave Daniel any sense of closure. And what unsettled him more was how casually Evan spoke, as though the affair had been an unavoidable outcome rather than a deliberate betrayal of trust. Daniel listened quietly, absorbing each word while noticing how Evan avoided taking real responsibility, instead framing the affair as a complicated situation fueled by emotional confusion. And though Daniel felt a brief flicker of anger, he steadied himself, reminding his mind that emotions left unchecked could lead a man into dark territory, and he had no intention of becoming someone he wasn't. He told Evan he didn't want revenge or conflict, but demanded distance, boundaries, and an end to the secrecy that had shaped the last decade of his life. And Evan nodded quickly, almost gratefully, relieved that Daniel hadn't arrived to confront him with violence or public humiliation. As they spoke, Daniel found himself studying Evan not as a rival, but as a deeply flawed man who had allowed deftly selfish impulses to override morality. And instead of anger, Daniel felt a strange sympathy, not forgiveness, but an understanding that people often destroy others not out of hatred, but out of weakness and fear. And this realization gave Daniel a sense of control he hadn't felt in weeks. By the time the conversation ended, Daniel walked back to his truck with a quiet confidence, knowing that the truth, while painful, had given him the clarity he needed to move forward without being consumed by revenge. He drove away thinking not of Evan's excuses, but of the life he wanted to rebuild. A life rooted not in betrayal, but in self-respect and emotional strength. Returning home after confronting Evan, Daniel entered the house with a sense of distance, as though he were stepping into a place he once knew but no longer recognized, and the silence inside felt heavier than ever, filled with echoes of conversations, argument, and memories that had shaped the last 10 years. He walked through each room slowly, touching the furniture, glancing at family photographs, and noticing how many objects carried stories he no longer believed in. And the more he looked, the more he felt like a visitor rather than a husband or father, because the home that once represented stability now felt like a museum of illusions built on years of deception. Daniel sat at the dining table where countless meals had been shared, countless anniversaries celebrated, and countless decisions made. And he realized how deeply betrayal scars the spaces that once felt safe, altering the emotional architecture of a home until even the walls feel unfamiliar. As evening approached and sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin stripes, Daniel began packing some of his belongings, not to leave permanently, but to create emotional separation, a small step that allowed him to reclaim control over his life, and he found the process strangely calming, giving him clarity and helping him focus on the future rather than the past. While packing, Daniel discovered a box of old letters and photos from the early years of his marriage. And though he felt a brief pang of nostalgia, he closed the box gently, understanding that nostalgia often disguises the truth by softening the edges of painful memories. And he refused to let himself fall into that trap. He sat on the couch and reflected on the last few weeks, realizing how far he had come from the man who first heard the voicemail, a man broken by shock and disbelief, and how he now stood on firmer emotional ground, no longer drowning, but slowly rising above the waves. Yet, he also knew the journey wasn't over, because healing was not a single decision, but a continuous process that required time and resilience. And though the house still felt heavy with unresolved pain, Daniel felt the first signs of internal peace, quiet. Later that night, the children returned home from a weekend trip with Monica's sister, their innocent chatter filling the house with life again. And Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose, because, despite everything, his love for them remained steady, unaffected by the turmoil between him and Monica. And as he tucked them into bed, he realized that while betrayal had changed him, it hadn't taken away the parts of him that mattered most. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with decisions that would shape their future, but for the first time, he felt capable of walking that road without losing himself. When Monica returned 2 days later, she entered the house cautiously, sensing the emotional shift in Daniel immediately, and she found him in the living room seated calmly, not tense or angry, but composed in a way that unsettled her more than any argument could have. And when she asked if they could talk, Daniel nodded, prepared for a conversation he had been rehearsing quietly in his mind since the moment she left. Monica sat across from him, her hands clasped together, her voice trembling as she asked whether he intended to leave, whether he hated her, and whether their marriage had reached its final end. And Daniel listened patiently before responding with a level of clarity she didn't expect, telling her that anger no longer controlled him, and that what he needed more than anything was honesty, not selective truth, not half-formed explanations, but full transparency about the decisions that had shaped the last decade of their lives. As Monica began explaining her reasons again, Daniel noticed how different he felt. Listening now, her words no longer pierced him, no longer stirred confusion or fear, but simply clarified the emotional distance that had been forming between them long before the affair. And Monica admitted that the relationship with Evan had started during a period when she felt disconnected from marriage, overwhelmed by motherhood and unsure of her own identity. Yet her reasons, while heartfelt, did little to soften the impact of her actions. Daniel thanked her for her honesty, but explained that betrayal leaves permanent marks. And though he wasn't consumed by anger anymore, he understood that trust could not simply be restored with apologies or explanations. He told her that they needed separation, not as punishment, but as a path toward individual healing. And though Monica cried quietly, she didn't argue, perhaps realizing that Daniel's calmness reflected not indifference, but acceptance, a recognition that their marriage had reached a point where staying together without rebuilding themselves first would only cause further damage. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, filled with painful reflections and quiet admissions. But when it ended, Daniel felt lighter, as though the weight he had been carrying finally loosened around his chest. And Monica, though heartbroken, seemed to understand that this moment wasn't about punishment, but about closure, the kind necessary for both of them to find their way forward. As she gathered a few things and prepared to leave, Daniel walked her to the door with a sense of finality, not rejection, but release. And when the door closed behind her, he felt a profound stillness settle inside him, marking the first true step toward healing and the beginning of a life built not on past illusions, but on newfound strength and emotional clarity. In the weeks that followed Monica's departure, Daniel focused on rebuilding his life piece by piece, starting with establishing routines that brought him a sense of control and grounding. Waking early for morning runs, cooking healthier meals, reading books he once set aside due to exhaustion, and spending more intentional time with his children. Discovering that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about reclaiming the parts of himself he had ignored while prioritizing everyone else. He returned to work with renewed clarity, maintaining professionalism while allowing himself the space to process emotions without burying them. And even his colleagues noticed the change, commenting on how calm and centered he seemed despite what he had been through. On weekends, Daniel began restoring an old shed in the backyard, turning it into a small workshop where he could channel his thoughts into building something tangible, something that symbolized progress and personal growth. And the more he worked, the more he realized that creating new foundations, physically and emotionally, brought him hope in ways he hadn't expected. He also met with a counselor recommended by a coworker, initially unsure about opening up to a stranger, but soon discovering how beneficial it was to talk through the layers of betrayal, identity loss, and emotional burnout that had accumulated over the years. And through these sessions, Daniel learned that strength wasn't about silence, but about acknowledging pain and addressing it with honesty. Over time, he found himself letting go of resentment, not for Monica's sake, but for his own, understanding that carrying anger only keeps the past alive, and he wanted a future where peace outweighed regret. Meanwhile, Monica and Daniel maintained respectful distance while co-parenting, communicating only for the children's needs. And though their conversations remained brief, there was a mutual understanding that the choices ahead would be made with maturity and care, ensuring the kids felt loved and supported. One evening, months after their separation, Daniel stood in his backyard workshop, looking at the shelves he had built, the tools arranged neatly and the half-finished projects waiting for his attention. And he realized how far he had come from the night he first heard the voicemail, a night filled with shock and heartbreak that once felt impossible to move beyond. Now he stood as a man who had faced betrayal, confronted truth, and chosen healing over vengeance. And as he stepped outside into the cool evening air, he felt the quiet freedom of a future no longer defined by past wounds, but by the strength he had gained through enduring them. Looking up at the sky slowly darkening with stars, Daniel took a deep breath and embraced the new chapter of his life, one built on resilience, clarity, and the promise of peace.